I also would like to introduce you to our lovely panelists. Many of them are repeat because they have been so wonderful in the past. Erica Downing is an MTSU graduate. She started as a sexual assault volunteer advocate at the Murfreesboro Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Center, and she's now the director of that center. She's not feeling well today, but she's still joining us via Zoom. So if you have questions for her, she is still going to be helping respond and available for the Q&A. So thank you, Erica, for joining us virtually. To my left here is Kat Pulcinelli. She is an intimate partner violence survivor, a book co-author, the host of the podcast Real Chat with Kat, which is like a top 10 10% globally ranked podcast. She's a motivational speaker and she focuses on topics like domestic violence, awareness, the impact that invisible scars can have on us, and the importance of personal resilience and reclaiming power from the past. Next is Tommy Roberts. He's a detective. He's currently with the sexual assault and domestic violence and stalking detective with the MTSU Police Department. He retired from a 25-year career at Murfreesboro Police Department, where he spent 15 years as a founding member and detective of the MPD Special Victims Unit and worked as a domestic violence detective. Barbara Scales is the Executive Director of Organizational Compliance and Enrichment at Motlow State Community College and is the former director of the June Anderson Center for Women and Non-Traditional Students here at MTSU. Christy Sigler began practicing law in 2006. She chose to focus on children, parents, and grandparents in cases involving abuse, neglect, custody, termination of parental rights, adoption, and delinquency. She's now the Title IX coordinator here at MTSU and serves as assistant to the president for institutional equity and compliance. Natalie Schilling serves as the policy and advocacy associate at Awake, Tennessee, where she channels her expertise in social work into driving systemic change. She's a graduate of Belmont University with a bachelor's degree in social work. Natalie is deeply committed to addressing domestic and interpersonal violence through a top-down approach. We have full panelist bios. This is just a very small snippet. If you want to learn more about any of our panelists, see some of their contact information, link out to some of the organizations they care about, you can do that by using the QR code that's provided on the handout or on the slide up here. Okay, so let's get to some of the prepared questions. I'm excited to have our panelists here today. We're going to be talking about a lot of different types of violence. So when I say things like partner violence or abuse, I'm talking about all three. Intimate partner violence, commonly known as domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking. It could be any one of those, so you can respond based on what you know about. That's totally fine. Hopefully, if our ASL interpreter gets here soon and they get set up, it's important to remember to speak one at a time so that she can interpret when she's here for that. So we're going to start with Kat here. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the signs of domestic violence and abuse, whether you're in an abusive relationship, like trying to figure out if this is you, are you a victim? Or maybe if you have a friend, you're trying to figure out if maybe something fishy is going on there. What should we be looking for?
Definitely. I love this question. So when it comes to the signs of domestic violence and abuse, there are going to be both potential physical, but more than likely emotional or psychological. So these are going to be signs that you are not really going to see or pick up on. As someone that was in an abusive relationship for 10 years, I can strongly tell you that I didn't even realize that I was in a relationship like that until I was 8 years in. So the signs are usually very subtle when it comes to the things that happen. And this is going to be signs such as jealousy. So you may notice it, like they don't want you to go anywhere. They don't want you to hang out with your friends. They start isolating you from the people that you are around, which is what happened to me. I lost contact with my family. They weren't able to come to my son's birth at the hospital. So these are some of the things that you have to be very, very diligent and aware of, because again, it's not something that you were thinking of or that you're going to see and go, oh my gosh, this is what domestic abuse is. It's very, very subtle. I know a lot of you may have heard what's called love bombing. So people that are looking to be very, very over dramatic when it comes to showing love and affection, to the point of where it's almost kind of creepy, and you know that something is a little up, but at the same time you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So these are some of the signs that you're going to be looking for. One of the other things that I noticed was in my relationship was blame to other people. It was never his fault for absolutely anything. And even if I was able to point out the facts that stated why it was somehow turned around, and it was always because of something that I did. I was the one that started it. So be aware of things like that. The other thing can also be sudden mood swings. I used to have very huge mood swings from having a really great time and my kids having a great time to all of a sudden a complete outburst of rage, which ended up being my fault. I did something wrong. I looked at someone wrong. I didn't say the right thing. And so it's all about building them up. It's all about making them feel good about themselves and you feeling like you are always the one that is doing something wrong. So those are things that you'll notice inside of that relationship. Now, when it comes to if you happen to have someone you think may be in something like that, again, the signs are going to be very, very subtle. So if you're hanging out with someone, you may not notice absolutely anything. I worked in the medical field for over 5 years, and no one had a clue that I was going through this. So some of the subtle signs are going to be maybe that they're a little bit more timid. You know that when they're around that significant other, they're a little bit quieter than they normally are. Maybe they're not speaking up as much. Maybe they're not as opinionated as you're used to hearing them be. These are some of the things that are the signs of control because they're being taught to be small so that they don't have to be heard. Again, you're going to be looking for signs of control, or what happened to me a lot was defensiveness. So anytime anyone would say anything about my ex, I would immediately come to his defense. I'll give you an example. One of the things that my ex did was I was not allowed to drive myself to and from work. That is because we had one vehicle. And so the reason was that I needed it in case I needed to go somewhere. And I completely understood, right? I'm a reasonable person. But I would be dropped off at the door and he would sit in front of the glass doors and wait until I walked to the back and he couldn't see me anymore. And then he would drive off. Now, I actually had someone that said, that's a little strange. I've never really had anybody do that. I've heard of people being in situations where that's considered abuse. And I immediately became defensive. Well, there's no reason. He would never do that. He loves me. He's just being protective. He's just watching over me. So if you happen to hear someone that is constantly taking the blame or being defensive, that could be a very, very strong sign that they have someone on the other side that is essentially brainwashing them. It is a type of control, again, to make you feel small and stop believing in what you know to be true. So those are just some of the bigger signs that I personally have seen and I have seen in other people. But again, none of the signs that you are going to recognize are going to be out there unless you find someone that's been in a relationship that maybe has physical bruises. But I can tell you from my experience, that didn't happen until several years into my relationship, and my bruises were never visible.
Thank you for that, Kat. We're going to go ahead and transition a little bit, but our panelists can feel free to add on to signs of different types of violence as we keep talking. I'd like to go to Erica and then Tommy on this next question about intervention. For those who are in fields who primarily deal with intervention, that's what we do when we're already in a crisis situation. What is the professional response and process after somebody reports something like domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault? What happens after someone reports, including what kind of resources are available to victims? And I'm going to let Erica kick us off with this question, and then she can pass it to Tommy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca. So from our perspective at the Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Center, sometimes we deal with survivors who have not reported to law enforcement because not everyone feels comfortable in reporting to law enforcement. But I will say that in Rutherford County, with all of our law enforcement agencies, they do a phenomenal job to make sure that they connect survivors with resources within our county. The, we get calls on a daily basis from Murfreesboro Police Department and Rutherford County Sheriff's Department that they have been in some type of interaction with a survivor and wanting to make sure that they know where they can go to seek an order of protection, perhaps our emergency safe shelter. even our counseling services, or even our on-site forensic examination room for a sexual assault. They want to make sure, our law enforcement officers want to make sure that our survivors are getting in contact with advocates at our agency, because they do know how important that is, that when someone experiences that type of trauma, that they know where to go. Because in those moments of trauma, you're not able to think clearly or logically. And so your first step is not always to, oh, let me find my domestic violence program, or let me find my sexual assault program in my county, because that's not where your thought process is. And so after someone reports to law enforcement, our advocates are able to support them in the ways that the survivor wishes. We want to make sure that they're empowered to make their own decisions, but also feel supported. So if that means accompanying them to a law enforcement interview, accompanying them to a criminal courts proceeding, which can be a very intimidating process for most survivors, knowing that they have to be in court with their abuser, and it's going to be an uncomfortable situation, but they have someone in court that supports them during that process, so that they do feel like they are being heard and they do know how to navigate those situations. I can't say enough good things about our law enforcement within our county, because they truly have the desire to make sure that our survivors get contacted with our advocates. And of course, all of our services are available 24/7. We have our crisis lines for both our domestic violence and our sexual assault services, so that if it's 2 a.m. in the morning, then it's 2 a.m. in the morning and our survivors have access to our services. And I think that's so important in those moments of crisis, that you do have someone that you can call and depend on.
Thank you, Erica. Tommy, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I'll touch on basically what a police response is. If they get a call, whether it's a 911 call or straight to dispatch, and there are different stats out there that talk about how many incidents have to occur before a victim calls, situations like that. A lot of times, especially in a campus environment or an apartment environment, it might not have been the victim that called. Could have been the next door neighbor that heard something, that they were alarmed, so they called. But just like any other scene we go to, first thing we want to do is make sure it's safe. There's no weapons involved. You check to see if there was weapons used as far as a threat or the abuse. You determine a primary aggressor, and unlike any other aspect of the law in the state of Tennessee, we have a lot of discretion, a lot of autonomy. Shame on you, let you go. Let's just get rid of the weed. Don't do that anymore. Get on your way. Domestic isn't like that. Okay, if we can determine a primary aggressor, somebody's going to jail. I mean, it's just we don't have a vote in that. I'm not a big fan of the victim ever taking out the warrant. I think that's something law enforcement should do. We're the professionals, because, and she made a lot of good points. You're almost re-victimizing the victim if the perpetrator sees her name, and I'm saying her, but the victim's name on the warrant. So I always think it's important. We're the officers, we're the professionals. We should do that. We are very fortunate in this county and on this campus to have a lot of counseling services. Because after we do the law enforcement part of it, where we've arrested someone, or even if not arrested someone, there wasn't that they ran or weren't around or something of that nature, we have literature and information that we can give. Our domestic violence sex assault center that's run by Erica is one of the best in the state, if not the nation. It's fantastic. I'm a big fan of it. Right here on campus, we have counseling services. We have the June Anderson Center. There's lots of counseling. I want to touch on what's your name? I'm sorry. That Kat said. As a police officer, we're going in there. Maybe we've had a bad day. Maybe we've just left a child abuse call or a bad wreck where somebody's hurt. Okay. Or maybe we've been at this house before and we're frustrated because the victim doesn't want to do anything. Okay. It's not a good idea to go in and just start, I'll just talk to you like the police to, just calling the perpetrator this asshole. Why don't you dump this? You don't do that. Okay. Because believe it or not, the victim may know good things about this guy. I mean, there may be some good things about it, but that's not your job. Your job is to arrest and take the perpetrator to jail and offer any kind of services, which there are plenty here in this county to the victim. Another thing that I want to touch on, you were fantastic. I thought the rest of us should have got up and left because it was done. It was over after that. Was in a relationship, if somebody it appears to be growing where they want to better themselves in that relationship, a lot of times that the other person, that party wants to keep them down. Okay, it don't know what it is, don't know if it's just human nature or what, but they want to keep them down. Uh, I'll give you a little case I'm on, and then I'll cut it off here, Rebecca. But had this couple, had been married for 20 years, pretty good marriage. This guy worked in a factory. He walked to work every day. Okay, walked to work every day. She had really just stayed at home. They had a nice little house. She decided to go back to MTSU. She goes back to MTSU. She's almost ready to graduate. She's got all these promotion opportunities at the new job she had got at State Farm. And she noticed that, and I found this out later, but she noticed that he was trying to, oh, you don't need this education. We can be happy and this sort of stuff. She comes home for lunch, which she did every day from work. Okay, on garbage day, how you roll out the garbage can to the front sidewalk. Well, she had rolled out there that morning and noticed that it wasn't there. So, she said, "Oh, my husband must have came home. That's odd. He never does that." She walks in. He walks into the front door. Guy standing there with a shotgun. Says, "There's two shells. There's one for me, one for you." And all this started because he felt like he was, and he tells you this, he goes, "Because I'm going to lose you anyway. I don't have much education. My life is set, and I'm never going to, be able to do the things that he thought, although she still loved it. She'd never thought this stuff about leaving him, but in his head, he had built that. And so that's kind of touching on what she says. And I probably talk too much on that, but just these real life things, you just see it. And that was I still think about that call every day. It was the first call I got as a detective. First call I got as a detective. So I was able to do a lot of interviewing and things of that nature and get some details. But I want to end it on a positive note. We have outstanding resources in this county. Outstanding, from right here at this school to Erica's organization. So if you ever need any help, you don't have to get law enforcement involved. You can call people and be anonymous. But just remember, if law enforcement ever does arrive somewhere and there's been an assault, the law is clear, shall make an arrest.
Thanks for sharing those stories. I feel like this is really why we have the panels, right?
Right.
We like sit in classrooms and we hear about statistics and theories and whatever, but there's a certain kind of understanding and knowledge that comes from working with survivors, being a survivor, the jobs that y'all do. This is the kind of knowledge that we need to hear more of in academic settings. So with that, let's move on to our next question about advocacy and support. And I'd like for Christy to start us off, and then Barbara, you can follow that up. How can we best support survivors of intimate partner violence, stalking, or sexual assault? When and how should we intervene as teachers, friends, families, community members if we suspect or know that violence is occurring? Are there do's and don'ts of providing support?
Yeah, so I think the kind of fundamental thing about how to support people is to understand that everybody's experience is different. You can't have an expectation of how somebody should respond to whatever situation they're in. Everyone responds to trauma differently. And so I would say meet people where they're at, and be there with them as they go through the process. Um, I've got a sheet that I'll share with Dr. Oldham when we get done. But um, I first things first, there at MTSU, there is no requirement that things be investigated. So people can come to us to get resources, to get questions answered, just to be able to vent. But it doesn't mean that they have to have a full investigative process. We're not going to reach out to the police. We're not going to do our own investigation unless somebody wants us to, except in very limited circumstances, like where there's a serial offender or, something that causes ongoing risk for the entire campus community. But I'll tell you what I have on my list is first things first, consider your approach. Make sure that when you talk with someone about these things, you're picking a setting where you're not likely to be interrupted or overheard, and that you have time to let this person share what they need to share. You don't want to be rushed. Don't judge, just let them know that you're concerned by what you see and that you want to help. And then listen, which can be the hardest thing, is just to listen. It may take them some stumbling words to get out what they need to, but your patience in letting them do that can be really beneficial. Try not to ask too many questions, because ultimately what you want to do in this setting is to be able to connect them with resources that can help them. If you're not a professional, your goal should be to connect them with the professionals, right? Whether that's counseling, medical care, sexual assault center, police, Title IX, whatever it may be. But with each of those instances, the individual who's been victimized is going to have to share those details. And it is extraordinarily hard to do that. So we don't want to put people through that process any more than absolutely necessary. So that's why we say try not to ask too many questions. Another tip is to stay calm. It can be really upsetting if they tell you that someone is harming them, period. It can be even worse if it's someone you know, someone you respect. Um, you know, and if they see you get angry, or, emotionally upset about what's happening, it might cause them to shut down. So try to be a statue, take what they have to say, digest it later, and respond on your own time, instead of responding in the moment. And then reassure them, let them know they are not in trouble. I don't care what somebody wears, what they drink, what kind of drugs they have. It does not give another human being the right to violate them. They're not in trouble for doing those things. And then connect them. Make sure that you're taking that step, that active step of saying, can I connect you with someone who can help? Ultimately that should be your goal. And then thank them for trusting you enough to share. That really can be the thing that kind of puts wind in their sails and helps them get through to the next step. And the next step after that is knowing that like somebody cares enough to let them be vulnerable, and to want to connect them with help. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
This is her domain. This is her house. So I want to make sure she gets what she needs to get. This is her house. I see some Montlow people that used to be at Montlow, so I'm so glad to see you here. We see you roaming around the hall. So hello, my peeps at Montlow. But I do want to address what Kat said. I think Kat did a beautiful job when she said that some of the signs are not visible. And I think so many of us automatically assume that they're going to be visible. One of the things I want to add to her piece is that sometimes if you see someone that is bringing fear to that individual, as far as punching holes in the wall or throwing things across the room, and you see that, they're not going to be visibly scars there, but most definitely that's also considered intimate partner violence. So I also want to bring that out as well. Stalking is another huge thing that we don't talk about a lot when it comes to IPV, and it is huge. It has grown tremendously on every single campus across the United States. It spiked up. We thought, I know, at our institution that we weren't going to receive a lot of investigations in the pandemic, and we did. And most of it had to do to digital, right? Stalking. And so stalking is real, it happens. And so we want to make sure that people are aware that stalking is out there, but digital stalking is even more so. And when I say that, it's to the point to where we see where they are intimidating them and showing up where they don't, where they don't supposed to be, like they're showing up at the grocery store, or they are doing persona profiles and coming up with other profiles to stalk that person, or they're reaching out to their family and their friends on the social media to get in touch with that person. And so you got to make sure that you're aware of that. That's also considered stalking in IPV. So making sure that you're aware of that as well. Did I miss anything?
The only other thing that I would mention about stalking is that we tend to see a lot more men as victims
Absolutely.
in stalking than we do with other
Absolutely.
forms of IPV. And you know, really any kind of harm can happen to any individual. It doesn't matter how you identify. And women absolutely can be aggressors. But we do see more men as victims in stalking.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. One thing I want to add to what Christy said was making sure that if someone comes and talks to you and they're telling you about their situation, they're telling you about what happened, make sure you prioritize their safety. Make sure you ask them, are you safe? Are you in a safe place? Okay. That's what the first thing you want to ask. Do you feel safe now? If they don't, then you reach out to someone immediately, law enforcement, someone to get them help in that point in time. And I always like to tell people when you know someone, because people are not, if they're in an IPV situation, we know that it takes several times for people to leave. All right. And so if you are, and I dealt with this with a cousin of mine, so it's very close to home. And I remember she would come to us, she would tell us what was going on, she did not leave. And so we end up coming with safety plans for her. Like, if you feel like you're unsafe, this is what you need to do. If you feel like you're unsafe, call us and give us a code word. So we came up with code words for her to give us if she felt unsafe in that moment, so that we knew that she was unsafe. And so I would tell you to come up with a safety plan with that individual. If they're coming to you, then you help them come up with a safety plan, because they may not leave right away, but you support them in that way. Is there anything I need to add?
I think so.
That's it for that piece.
Thanks.
You want to go to the do's and don'ts or something else?
I think Kat wanted to add something to the conversation before we move to prevention.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to follow up on both Christy and Barbara in regards to when you have someone that comes forward that is giving you some information, even if it's very subtle and you can tell that they're uneasy.
Yeah.
You have to understand that you can't necessarily be the hero in this scenario. Every survivor has to make the choice to want to leave.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, if you try to force that choice too soon, they are immediately going to go into survival mode. And all they're going to be able to focus on is what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen when they find out what I did. And they're more likely to go back so that they can apologize because it wasn't their fault. So as much as you want to be able to prevent things from happening, and I personally have a really hard time with this when I'm in certain situations and I know there is something going on with a stranger, I know that I can't intervene. I know that even though I want to help and solve their problem, I can't just step up and tell someone to shut up and stop speaking to them like that. Because ultimately what happens is if that person is not in a safe environment, you have now created a trifecta. So when they go home, it's worse on them and you thought you were being helpful. So please be aware at the situations that you are in and you are involved in, and just know that as much as we know that you want to help, it has to be our decision to leave.
Thank you for adding that. It's super important to understand. Thank you. All right, this is a great time to move on to our question about prevention. And just a reminder, you can write your notes for our panelists on the back of your handout. We're going to have plenty of time to ask more questions. So I'm going to kick this off with Natalie. What kind of large scale cultural, legal, or policy changes would you like to see implemented to better prevent this kind of violence from happening in the first place or to make interventions more effective?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I feel like I could address all of it with like its own 30-minute talk, but when it comes to prevention, I think it starts as early as possible, and that comes with funding these early intervention programs as well as working with education in schools, starting from young, developmentally appropriate, teaching healthy relationships, consent, teaching children that they have authority over their body. They're allowed to say no to adult hugs, things like that that start off young and scaffold throughout their life. In Tennessee, our sexual education program is called the Family Life Curriculum. And it's kind of a joke to the rest of the country. But things like improving those family life curriculum and education is always where I think it starts. And then in a bigger sense of the word, better funding, just period. In Tennessee, we don't have state funding for as far as I talked to our lobbyist, she told me we don't have any state funding for domestic violence services right now. A lot of it comes from the federal, and right now we know that federal department funding is pretty much in question. And so like a lot of these prevention work that's being done in schools and throughout the community is at risk of being defunded. And so I would say definitely working there. And then in terms of services working better, there's a lot. But we are working with like a partner on HB 696, and that's just making sure that there is a sexual assault response team coordinator in the state. There's sexual response teams throughout the state, but a lot of them are missing things. And so to have one person making sure that all the states are doing the same great work is really important. So we know that's one bill in Tennessee that could help. But I would also say just legal system wise, even like Nashville touts its like incredible victim services. And I went with a friend through the system, and by God, I couldn't even navigate it. And I am considered an expert on a lot of these things. And so there's just so many places where people can fall through, and victim has no idea what's going on, and they're going to have to see their offender again. And it's full of gaps and holes. And I'd really just want to rethink the whole thing, but I can't right now. But I would just say, like, there's just so many places that we could work on making sure victims understand what's going on and feel like they have agency over the process, especially in the appeals process, if that happens. And they have to keep coming back and arguing and seeing the offender and halting their healing time. It's so hard. Also, this is really specific, but rape kit turnaround times are insane still. Last I checked this morning, we're still at like 10 weeks for a lot of places in the state of Tennessee of rape kit turnaround times. That's crazy. A lot of these legal processes say they need all of this evidence before they can move forward, especially in these emergency situations where someone actually goes and gets a restraining order. You need that information as soon as possible. And we got 10-week turnaround times. So I'd say that. And then just in general, in the legal process, I know I went through this in my own life, but there's a consideration that emotional and psychological abuse is less harmful than physical abuse. That's in a lot of statute. That's in a lot of like actual legal processes, how much compensation you get. Emotional and mental abuse is not considered as bad as physical abuse. And I think that's something systemically and culturally we need to change. So we know that emotional and mental abuse leaves just as many scars as physical abuse. And so like if I could wave a magic wand, one of the things I would change would definitely be making sure that emotional and mental abuse is treated just the same as that physical abuse, and that victims are not made to feel like their abuse was less than because maybe the offender didn't touch them, you know? So a lot of things, but also underlying just funding. We do not fund victim services and domestic violence help as much as we should, especially in consideration with like how much we spend on military and that enacting violence. We don't do nearly as much on the other side of things. So yeah.
I know Tommy wanted to follow up as a police officer, makes a lot of sense. And then I was thinking maybe Erica would like to add on after Tommy provides some comments.
Yes, Natalie mentioned SART, Sex Assault Response Team. And myself and Christy Siegler are a part of the Rutherford County Sex Assault Response Team. And basically it's made up of advocates, law enforcement, district attorneys, nurses, medical people, that discuss, how to best go about, preventing it and going forward and prosecuting. The one thing that was frustrating, and Erica may jump in here on this as well, is to get a victim, you have someone that's a victim of a sex assault or rape. And as a law enforcement officer, I want any evidence I can get. And part of that evidence is a sex assault kit. Now, unfortunately, just the way it is, most victims aren't a victim and they just rush right over to us, and we got all that. Usually there's a day or two that goes by. However, St. Thomas Rutherford here in Murfreesboro for the longest did not do sex assault kits. Can you imagine? I mean, so we have someone that wants to report or not report. They just kind of want to do the sex assault kit just in case they decide to report. And then you tell them, because I know Erica's organization will also do them, but they're limited with their personnel. And so we would have to give them a map to General Hospital in Nashville. How sickening is that? That just, again, and maybe it just rubbed me the wrong way. I think it rubbed Christy the wrong way too.
For sure.
Now, hopefully they've got that here. They tell us they've alleviated that problem. And so sex assault kits can be done. I was going to touch on something else, but I'll let Erica take over.
Okay, and I'll touch on what Tommy has addressed as well. Ascension St. Thomas, Rutherford did for an entire year not provide those examinations in Rutherford County, and those survivors were sent outside the county in order to get those kits completed. However, we know the likelihood if you report to one location and you're told to go to another location for that exam, the likelihood of you going to get that exam at another location after you have gotten up enough strength, guts, stamina to go to that first location, you're more than likely not going to go to that second location. My agency has worked very closely with Ascension St. Thomas in order to restore those exams. So they are actually now doing those exams while they're still building their pool of sexual assault nurse examiners. That is a process that takes a little bit of time to get the specialized training in order to collect that forensic evidence. But that is something that they are working on. I wanted to touch on what Natalie had said as well on the funding for victim services. In Tennessee, we do not have state funding for victim services. Those are typically your nonprofits across the state that are providing that service, and we are dependent on federal funding, and VOCA is at an all-time low. And all of us are looking at a 40% reduction in the funding that we receive. And so on the face of that, when you are reducing funding for victim services, you're not making the community any safer. You're going to prevent people from coming forward because agencies like myself are not going to have the manpower or the resources in order to provide those services. And, we're not going to be able to support law enforcement, as they are working with survivors and helping with order of protections, providing emergency safe shelter, counseling, all of those things. And so as a society, we all have to look at that bigger picture and really focus on victim services and really looking at turning a victim into a survivor, that they are coming forth to tell their story, and they need to have a safe place in order to do so, which is why those victim services across the state are so important.
Thank you, Erica. Tommy, do you remember what you were going to say?
No, I wanted to give props to Erica because she really pushed hard to get St. Thomas Rutherford back online. And I just kind of wanted to compliment her. We're very lucky to have Erica,
Yes.
extremely lucky. And, a lot of these nonprofit, we depend on the benevolency or the kindness of donors and things of that nature, especially since funding, it's just going to be cut back. I mean, that's just the way it is from a government funding standpoint. So Erica does a great job.
So before we move into our Q&A, I'm going to say it once and I'll say it again later. If you have a handout, and then again at the end of this presentation, there are QR codes where you can donate directly to the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Center that we have here. And I cannot emphasize enough how bad the funding situation is at this very moment. They really could use your help as soon as possible. So if you've got even $5 that you're willing to pitch in, it would be amazing. So with that, we've got our 35-minute Q&A. Is there anybody, and Genevieve, you mind grabbing one of our mics? Genevieve's going to bring mics. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question of one of our panelists? Yeah. Is that Dr. King over there? Oh, do you mind if she can bring you that so our online people? Oh, tech folks, are they the ones plugged in up there? Does she have the right ones? Yep. All right. Yeah. If you can use the mic, that way online people can hear us. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Is that working? Yeah.
I think that one's working.
Thank you.
Because, a lot of times too, because everyone asks those questions, well, why can't they just leave? Or what are some of the misconceptions, for me as a clinical social worker in the field too, because, we need to know what to do because too many times people have that misconceptions. What are the common misconceptions that you have encountered, Kat, that in your experience that, that people, are thinking, well, that why a person stays, how can we address that? Like you said, you gave a good example. Don't do it in front of the aggressor because that's just going to end up with a trifecta of abuse back at the home. But there's, a lot of times I know I have a friend and she went through a lot from a childhood on up, and she, talks to some of my students sometimes. But one of the things that there's just so many misconceptions of, well, why don't they just leave? What are, what misconceptions can you share with us in that?
Yeah, and I appreciate this question. This is actually one of my favorite questions to get because there are so many stigmas out there as to why someone goes through it. And I know that one of the biggest ones is, well, they probably had a really bad childhood. So I enjoy sharing my story because I actually had a really great childhood. I had a really great upbringing. My family is still together. I played a lot of sports. I was in choir. Like I had a lot of things going for me. And that's the really interesting part about abuse is, and that's why I talk about the reason why emotional and psychological needs to be paid attention to, because ultimately what ends up happening is you are slowly breaking down the confidence of someone to the point to where when they say, this is your fault, instead of you instantly going, no, it's not, you immediately internalize it and you go, well, is it? Did I have to say it that way? Is that what started that? And so that ends up being one of the reasons why people stay. And unfortunately, that is done so subtly that you don't even realize that it's happening until you're too far in. And then the other thing that tends to keep people in that situation, or I know that it did for me, is a lot of shame and guilt. I was a mother of 2 kids. When I left that relationship, my boys were 10 and 7. Do you know any mother that wants to come forward and tell people that she's in an abusive situation and her children are unsafe so that she looks like a bad mom? So there's a lot of other pieces and components, again, that are very psychological, that are the reasons why you tend to stay. Another one can also be codependency, which honestly is not something that I even realized I had. I am a very independent person, let me tell you. So this is not something that made a lot of sense to me until years after being out of that situation. And if you guys ever want to read a book, Codependency No More was an eye opener for me. So speaking on codependency, what it ends up actually being is it looks like you are being the helper. It looks like you are being the strong person for the family. You are taking care of them. You're making sure you're pushing them forward. But ultimately what you're doing is you're sacrificing everything of you to make sure it's good for them. And it is just this endless cycle that is extremely hard to get out of. I'm sure a lot of you have heard people pleasing. That is what it is, but like times 10, to the point to where every single thing that needs to be done is for them, and you are back here. You don't even exist. And that came from my children as well. So the aspects of the reasons why someone stays are a multitude. Barbara had mentioned threatening earlier. One of the things that my ex did to me, because I was young at the time, was I was always threatened. Well, if you leave me, what's going to happen to your kids? Well, at that time, I didn't know. I wasn't allowed to have a cell phone. We didn't have a lot of computers or internet and stuff like around where I could Google that stuff. So was he right? His father was in law enforcement. He must know the way that it works. So again, it's this manipulation. It's this ultimate control where they poke at things to see if you know how to come back at it. And the moment you don't have a surefire answer, they lay it on thick. And this is the reason why I say brainwashing is what it ultimately ends up being, because that is actually what I was diagnosed with, one of them, when I came out of my situation and went and spoke to someone.
Can I expand on this one more?
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry.
Oh.
I was going to say, because my friend that was involved in it too, she said that there were times, because, some of this happened when she was a child and then went into relationships. She said there was a time when that actually broke it, when she actually ended up in the ER. And somebody that recognized her from high school, he says, what happened to you? And he says, and it wasn't until then that she actually saw that list that said this is, in her mind, this was normal. And she didn't see it as I was being abused until she
Yep.
saw a list that described that to her. Then at that time, that was something that kind of broke that chain for her. But that normal pattern of behavior over and over just became the norm. And that was
Yep.
the expected part. I mean, what's your thought in that?
I appreciate you bringing this up, because this is something I speak on a lot, is for people to understand that your brain is not meant to see everything that's going on. It's meant to keep you safe. That is the brain's ultimate response. So if you are in a situation where your brain is used to seeing the same thing happen, right? You've got your highs and you've got your lows, but your brain knows the outcome, meaning I know if I say this, it's going to trigger a fight, but I know how to handle it. I know that if I do this, it's going to trigger this, but I know how to handle it. Your brain would rather keep you in a cycle like that because it understands the outcomes versus it saying, this is not what you need to be in. You should go over here into the unknown, and this is going to be safer. And that is ultimately what happens in your brain. So while logically you don't see that, subconsciously your brain is keeping you safe, and your brain sees it as, we know how to handle this situation, but if we leave, that's a whole world of unknowns. How in the heck are we going to survive?
I want to add something. Can I do that?
I was gonna let
Okay.
Barbara add, and then I see Natalie's been waiting too.
I love when I get this question as well, because I think it's such a good question. And I think it's such a loaded question as well, because there could be so many dynamics added to that. One dynamic could be a person's religion or culture, right? It's tied to that. So if their religious is saying that you need to stay with this person until you leave this earth, and that's a big part of it. If their culture, or if their culture is saying that one gender is better than the other, and that you just need to be in that until then, that's another big part of it as well. So I think it's such a loaded question because there's so many dynamics to it. If you have a male that's being subjected to the partner violence, that's a whole nother stigma added to it, right? So I think it's such a loaded question of why people stay in a situation. I think for us, for me, it's really about being educated about all those misconceptions. I just got through just gathering my data for my dissertation. One of the questions was around that. Why do people, not report? Why do people stay? And one of the things that I've been realizing is that people in that survey that I did just didn't really know what to do when they saw it. And so it's kind of like that freeze or flight kind of thing situation. So they really didn't know what to do. And so giving them ways of how to do that, whether it's, building a culture of civility and respect, where your culture is now, we're going to respect each other in civility. Part of this, educating each other, is a part of that, right? So just misconceptions of what do I do? And I don't know what to do. How do I handle that situation when it happens? Is building things like this, education, things like this, and making people aware, building social media campaigns, right? To where now people are getting educated more about it. More people like Kat, sharing their stories and people hearing their stories. That's a huge part of it. And that's what I found out in my dissertation. I just wanted to add that piece.
Thanks. Go ahead, Natalie.
Yeah, I also feel like we haven't touched on it like explicitly, but financial manipulation is one of like the
Absolutely.
huge parts of this, where many victims of domestic violence in IPV, they may not have any financial independence / none of their documents. So like I've heard of situations where the abuser will literally rip up a social security card, get rid of an ID, get rid of any document one could have to be independent from the other person. And I don't know if you've ever lost your ID, but by God, is it so hard? So imagine trying to do that while going through abuse and maybe not having any other documents or money of your own. Like, I think whenever I conceptualize that, I'm like, God, that must be impossible to do, to start and think, well, how do I do this? Then something else was, if you're in social work or any of this space, like the wheel of manipulation and control, the reconciliation part, it's not like every single second of the day you might overtly be fighting or overtly have this. There's often it's in a cycle. And one of those steps of the cycle is this reconciliation and a false, but you'll feel like it's real. Forget, like, I'm so sorry. I'm going to do better. Here are gifts. Here are whatever, love bombing, showering, to the point that you're already in so much manipulation and control that you're like, oh, I believe you. Like, you're going to change. This is going to get better. I love you. And so that reconciliation stage, I think, also gets left out of the conversation. And people just think, oh, well, you're constantly being yelled at, blah, blah, blah. Well, a lot of times it's in a cycle.
And if I may, the another reason that sometimes people don't leave actually is because of their pets.
Yeah, absolutely.
That a lot of times people don't think about that, the aggressor, the perpetrator will say, if you leave, I'm going to kill your dog, or it may not even be that overt, but there are actually programs out there that help people keep their animals when they go into a shelter. That's one of the great things that you can donate money towards. So be aware of that too.
Could I let Erica respond? She's not here physically. I want to make sure she gets a chance, and then you can go next.
I don't know how much more I can add to what everybody else says, added to the conversation. I think all of our different responses show that there are really so many multi-layers to someone leaving an abusive relationship. I think when people have not been through a violent situation, they think that it's very easy to leave. But when you've been through a violent situation, but you're still holding on to a part of that person that is still good. I think as human beings, we want to see the best in everyone. And that's especially what we like to think of with our partner as well. And even though things are bad, we hold on to the good. And that's what we always gravitate back to in those moments. And so it's not an easy break. And it's so hard to leave, and knowing that there are so many things that your abuser is going to use in order to make you stay. They've isolated you from your friends and family. The financial abuse we see that in 90% of the survivors that we serve. And when you're trying to start all over and you have nothing, it is really hard. Even though you're not happy in the relationship that you're in, it's not easy to leave knowing that you have nothing to go to. And so that question of why someone doesn't leave, it may sound innocent in nature, but when you do say that question and do ask that question, it really does cut someone off. they don't feel like they can move forward if, as they're telling you what's going on, what they've experienced, and the first thing that you say is, well, why don't you just leave? I don't know why you're putting up with that. Why don't you just leave? That just shuts them off. And the likelihood of them telling someone else what's going on decreases. And if they don't have a support system around them, it's really hard for them to go forward to an agency like mine or to law enforcement to report when they don't have a support system that even believes them and helps them with their next step forward.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Odom, can I add one more thing? Just one more, I promise. Another thing too that I think that we really need to, I remember this happened with our next door neighbor when we were living in Nashville when we first moved here some years ago, my husband and I, and there was a domestic violence situation going on between two females. And I remember my husband asking her, why don't you leave? It's something, this is not right. And she said, if I leave, she's going to disclose to my family my relationship, and I have not disclosed this to them yet. So that's another reason why people stay in relationships. So just be aware of that as well.
Yep. Genevieve, do you mind bringing it to? Oh, you already have it. You're good. Go ahead.
Yes, I want to thank you all for having the panel discussion. My name is Violet Cox Wingo, and I do have my social work practice class here. My question is, and we did go through, the chapter that dealt with, domestic violence, all the reasons why he or she may stay. But one of the things that, the research was pointing out that right after the survivor decides to make up his or her mind, they're going to leave. Could someone speak to that and look at the research when the person could be hurt or injured, or there could be death? Could someone please speak to that, please?
Who on our panel feels like they're most confident talking about what happens after someone decides to live in the dangers
All
with
I
that?
have is Dateline in 2020 and 48 hours, so you don't want mine.
So I can give you personal experience if you guys are interested in that. And that's a really great question. So interestingly enough, 8 years into my relationship, I made the decision that I wanted to leave. I put myself in contact with my family and I decided that I was going to make a plan and I folded on it.
Mm.
So a lot of times when you figure out that this is not what you want to do, it's not like I'm going to do this kind of a situation. There is still the aspect of being in survival mode, and that brain kicks in of, but what is the best decision? So I ended up waiting another 2 years. I was very blessed to get a better job that gave me the ability to at least have something when I left. But I was in that job for a while before I came forward. I'll give you something that's actually really interesting. So even though I knew that I wanted to leave, even though I started to learn that if I stayed quiet, he could only argue and scream and spit at me for so long, I actually did not come forward on my own behalf. So this is something that I really enjoy sharing because this is the importance of people listening to what you are saying. So I told you that I worked at a medical facility and I worked directly with patients and we did a lot of therapies. And I had a patient that came in on a regular basis that I knew was getting his law degree. And so I decided after a huge argument one morning where it was one of the first times I had ever had physical bruises left on me and I had a busted lip, that I was going to ask him some questions to get some information. I can't tell you what I did in that conversation, but whatever I said sparked him enough that when he finished his therapy, he sat up and he said to me, you have two options. Either you contact the police or I contact them for you, because I work in the domestic violence center of the police department, of the law enforcement, of the judges' chambers. I made that decision because he pushed me. And I know that we can't always push, but I was already ready, but I was looking for someone to reach that hand out. I actually came to work, went to the bathroom, cried myself to death, washed my face, and went to work with plans of going back home.
So this is why it is so important for other people to be listening for clues and to have those conversations. Because even though I wanted to leave, I was in that relationship for another 2 years until someone made that call that gave me the confidence to be like, you know what? This is happening.
You had mentioned earlier about how one reason victims don't leave is they know what to expect at home, right? But when you leave, like what's on the other side of that? And we know like if this is about control, and then you finally say, "No, I'm done with your control," their reaction to that can escalate, right? That's really dangerous, a really dangerous time. And that might be one reason that they stay is that they sense that there's danger
Yeah.
if they lose control. Erica, is this something that you want to talk about, that the dangers of leaving?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So when a survivor does make that choice to leave, that is the most dangerous time for them. Their abuser sees that power control slipping that they once had. And when people are in a desperate situation, they take desperate measures. And that's why some situations end in a domestic homicide, because that abuser can see their control, their grip slipping, and they will do anything in that moment to keep them in that situation. And if I can't have you, no one else will, that is exactly what that means, is that ends in your death. If you leave me, that ends in your death.
So, statistics that show there's an inordinate relationship between people who strangle their partners and wind up killing them. So if you ever run into somebody who has experienced strangulation, like it is critical that they get out of that relationship because they are really close to potentially losing their life.
Yeah,
me
I mean that
Emphasize that, what Chrissy just said. If you got a partner that's putting their hands around your neck, you are in danger. There was a study where some prisoners in federal prison and in state prison, all convicted of murder, were interviewed, and they had life sentences. So they had nothing to lose. They told the truth, and this is the ones that, it's a very simple survey. They just asked a question: in your lifetime, have you ever strangled anybody? And this had nothing to do with what they were in jail for the murder. 87% said yes, they had strangled somebody. That is and that's just the ones that said it. I mean, it could even be higher than that. Don't fool around with that. Doesn't take much pressure at all to cause permanent damage. But I just kind of started to jump over there, Chrissy. I just kind of wanted from a law enforcement that's now been bumped up here in the past couple of years, where if strangulation involved, it's now a felony. Domestic assault itself is just a misdemeanor. If strangulation's involved, and arm around the neck, we all know it's not choking. Choking's when you take a bite of food. Strangulation is what that is. So if you know anybody that man, try to get them safe.
I see Natalie. I'm going to let her answer. And then Riley, are there questions online? Okay. If our mic person can get a mic to Riley, after Natalie answers, we'll hear an online question.
It's just a real quick note. I also wanted to add, like, she kind of summarized everything I was going to say, but also there's a presence of a firearm in the home. I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's like 5 times more likely that the individual who's being harmed is going to be killed with that firearm. And that's why it's really important in domestic violence restraining orders, there is dispossession of a firearm. And I just wanted to connect to the policy piece a little bit, that we just recently had a Supreme Court case hearing whether that should still be legal, that dispossession of a firearm could happen with domestic violence restraining orders. So that's Rahimi v. US, if that's something that's interesting to you. I believe we're still waiting on
the
a decision on that one. So yeah, super important, but wanted to connect to the policy piece a little.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I'd like to do an online question because we've got comments in the past about forgetting about them. So if we can hear the online and then you'll be next.
So this question is specifically for Erica and Tommy, but if anybody else wants to pop in on this is perfect. The question is, how does immigration status affect access to resources or how situations are addressed?
Erica, you may go first.
I'll go ahead and go. I know this is a touchy subject right now. I think for all of us that are in the field, for us currently, it's not affecting any way that we provide services. It's not something that we are focused on as of asking, are you undocumented or are you documented? Those are not questions that come into our arena at this point. There are a lot of things on the federal level that are still yet to be determined, but it's not something that we are currently focused on until there's that hard, fast line as to how we have to proceed. Regardless of someone's immigration status, we are providing those services. If you're a victim, you're a survivor, then you are being provided those services. We're not asking a whole lot of questions. Kind of that don't ask, don't tell right now is kind of how we're focusing in on it, because if someone needs our services, then that is what we are focused on at this point.
And just to reiterate, just to go over what she just said, when police are investigating that, when we're dealing with a victim of stalking, a victim of sexual assault, a victim of domestic violence, immigration status is never brought up unless they bring it up. Maybe they, I distinctly remember one of them had said, "Hey, I still get offered these services because we give these little pamphlets." That absolutely. So it never really comes up, and I don't know of any law. I mean, I've been in this business 30 years. If there is a victim of a crime, we want to catch the bad guy. We don't care if you're from, wherever you're from, Europe, South America. We want to get the person that committed the crime against you. Now, I'll call him the bad guy or the person that we arrest. I have no idea what each jail policy, you'd have to talk to the sheriff, I guess, to find out if they notify ICE on the guy that we arrested for the crime. Now that may be a situation, but as far as a victim goes, never brought up. Don't care.
Natalie, what were you going to add?
But I think it's complicated for a couple reasons in that that's a really huge bargaining chip for an abuser. If one or both of them have question status is, well, if you go to anyone, we'll both get deported. Or if so like this is another bargaining chip. And then recent legislation has passed lately that requires local law enforcement divisions to cooperate with federal immigration. And so if, say, a victim does go and their documentation status is discovered, there's no longer discretion on if that law enforcement agency has to report it or not. That discretion got taken away last year, and legislation increasingly is being put. So if you go to the hospital, so say a victim who is undocumented goes to a local hospital, there's a bill this year that hospitals would have to ask immigration status before treating someone. So that could be a huge issue with someone getting treatment for medical things that were inflicted by someone and they have undocumented status. They may not go to that hospital because their immigration status is going to be questioned. So I do think it's getting even more complicated and getting really even more concerning for our undocumented neighbors who are potentially in these situations.
Yep. Thank you, Natalie. I want to take this last question in person. Is it Karma?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do I have to stand? Can I?
No.
I know you said that this was not your experience, Kat, as far as going through childhood abuse and that kind of going into domestic abuse later in your life. And Natalie, you kind of spoke on earlier how there's not a lot of funding for education or programs even around what healthy love should look like. So in lieu of those things, because in my experience, and I think a lot of people's experience, that was the pipeline of you learn these unhealthy behaviors of love and they carry on later into life. And you never really have anyone to stop and teach you like, hey, that doesn't seem right. So what do we do, I guess, in the meantime, while we don't have funding, while we don't have these educational programs, while people like me and a lot of people I know are still dealing with the tendency, I guess, to go back into these relationships because that's what's comfortable for them and they don't know any better.
So,
No.
I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead.
I'll be quick.
No.
One of the things that we do in my office is every year we do trainings for lots of different groups on campus. And we include information about healthy and unhealthy relationships, and examples of things. And we encourage people to not just kind of review that for themselves, but to look out for their friends. Because a lot of times you may not recognize it if you're in it, but other people can see it, and might be able to speak up and say, that doesn't look right. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't feel right. And so having these kind of external trainings, external to the major pipelines, hopefully gives some resource. Go ahead.
I was going to add basically the same thing, but I will say, I think on MTSU campus, I think you guys still have Power of One. You guys still have that?
Yes, we do.
The Power of One. So the Power of One is a organization that's out of the June Anderson Center that really talks about how to intervene, what healthy and unhealthy relationships look like. On our campus, we have what we call Empower that does that. I want to encourage people, if you are really passionate about this, you start your own organization here on this campus. Go to the Student Success, Student Affairs Center, the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership, and say, we want to start an organization that's going out and educating our community about what this looks like. If you are a part of a church, if you are a part of an organization within your community, if you are a part of fraternity and sorority life, whatever you're part of, you can be that advocate going out and educating people about healthy and unhealthy relationships and really what that looks like. It was amazing when I was on this campus and still on the campus at Montlow. I have my intern here that's talking about that, goes out, and she's now talking about that on our campus. But it's amazing when people really realize what's healthy and what's not. That's when people come to the aha moment of like, I'm not in a healthy relationship. And what happens is those unhealthy traits can prolong to IPV. So I think you're so right. What's your name? Karma, I think you're so right. I think it's the point to where we have to say, if federal funding is not there, I still have a voice, and my voice is powerful, and I can still speak up of what's healthy and what's not.
And I'd like to add to that as well. And this would be more of a personal revelation that I had. And being in you all's shoes, I was 18 when I got with my ex. So I was with him until I was 28. And I know that most of you are around that age, right? This is a time in your life where you are searching for validation. This is a time in your life where you are searching for other people to fill your cup. If I could have done anything differently in those situations, it would have been to shift my focus to me, to work on growing me, my confidence, my understanding, and my ability to have courage on me, making myself a priority. Because when you shift that focus, you are taking down that risk of wanting to go for someone else because you feel like you need to be their hero. You feel like you need to be able to help them because you want to help everyone. None of us here are meant to help everyone. But the one thing that you are meant to do is focus on you. Because when you fill your own cup and you understand who you are at your core, it is a lot easier for you to then externally recognize when someone is not treating you correctly because you have a standard and you have boundaries that you have put for yourself that I did not have. Even growing up in a great home, I was not taught boundaries. I was not taught to pay attention to people's perspectives. I just thought everybody was great and loved me. And so that was a hindrance because I didn't understand that. So while we do have a deficit in regards to education and getting things out there, you have the ability to build up your self-esteem, your self-confidence, and start putting things in place to protect yourself and being okay with saying no.
Thank you, panelists, so much. This is a really great place for us to wrap up. How about we give them a round of applause? I just want to remind you that these folks are spending day in, day out doing the hard work. Like They took time today to be here with us. We are grateful to have them. I am appreciative to have them. I wanted to remind you both on your handout and up here, you can donate both to our local domestic violence and sexual assault center, which Eric is representing.